Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into a topic that, it can feel a bit tricky or even restricted in Christian conversations.
Hmm.
Sex.
Right.
We want to go beyond just, chastity before marriage being the only option and explore a much wider perspective.
Exactly. And you, our listener, you might be coming from anywhere on the spectrum with this. Lots of different backgrounds, experiences, questions.
Hmm.
It's such a fundamental part of being human, and we want to look at it with, well, curiosity, but also respect for all those different views.
So, our roadmap for this is a PDF called Good Christian Sex: Why Chastity Isn't the Only Option and Other Things the Bible Says About Sex.
Sounds intriguing.
It really is. It's quite thoughtful, aiming to make these theological, ethical questions about adult sexuality feel clearer and more engaging.
Less intimidating, maybe.
Hopefully. So our mission today is really to pull out the core insights from this source, give you a shortcut, sort of, to understanding the different ways Christians approach things like pleasure, desire, intimacy, relationships.
And we should probably warn you, there might be some surprising takes in here.
Yeah,
Things that challenge, common assumptions.
definitely. Okay, let's dive in. The source starts right off with pleasure, specifically sexual pleasure.
Which, as you said, can be awkward.
Yeah, there's often this underlying tension, isn't there? This suspicion that if something feels really good, maybe it's not quite right.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm.
That if it feels right, it must be wrong kind of vibe. There's a history in some Christian thinking of being pretty wary of pleasure.
Right. The worry it could lead us astray.
Yeah. But this source flips that a bit. It points out that pleasure is, well, fundamental. It's something we encounter from day one.
So it encourages us to actually think theologically about why we experience pleasure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Makes sense of it. And it doesn't shy away from self-stimulation either.
Which it calls partnerless sex, interestingly.
Yeah, that phrasing is intentional. It uses it as a way to unpack cultural myths, some really outdated pseudoscience,
Hmm.
and also the very different ways our culture talks about it for men versus women.
That gender difference is huge, isn't it?
It really is. The source talks about how, historically, even among some first-wave feminists and certain fundamentalist groups, there was this idea that women were sort of inherently purer, while men had these base urges they needed to control.
That definitely feeds into those concepts of biblical manhood and biblical womanhood that became so rigid.
Right, particularly in the U.S., creating this kind of impossible split, the Madonna whore thing.
Hmm.
Women are either saints or temptresses.
And the source really pushes back on the idea that women are just less interested in sexual pleasure.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
It stresses how diverse human experience actually is. It's damaging to suggest one gender somehow owns desire more than the other.
It even mentions some of those bizarre historical myths.
All the old wives' tales.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like masturbation causing acne or hairy palms or blindness.
It's wild, isn't it? Where did that stuff even come from? It shows how deep the shaming goes.
And the source traces some of that negativity back to philosophical ideas like Plato's dualism and, body bad, spirit good.
And Augustine, who's obviously massively influential.
Okay, this part blew my mind a little. Augustine. Initially, he saw sexual pleasure as a huge problem, right? Something pulling us away from God.
That was his earlier view, yeah. Very suspicious of it.
But the source says later on, he actually argued that sex and reproduction were, normal and good, even in Eden.
That's the shift. His later thinking, based on Genesis, was essentially, why would God create woman if not for procreation and companionship, which involves sex? He saw it as part of the original goodness.
Wow, so even Augustine evolved on this. That really challenges a fixed view.
It does, and it raises that key question. Is pursuing pleasure automatically turning from God? Does it always equal lust?
And what does it do to us, especially kids, to teach that something so natural is inherently sinful?
Right, which leads to this pretty radical idea the source puts forward.
Yeah.
What if self-stimulation or partnerless sex when you don't have a partner is actually a gift?
A gift from God.
From a benevolent creator, yeah. If humans need bodily pleasure, and this is a safe way to meet that need, why not?
That reframes it completely. Not shame, but meeting a need.
Mm-hmm. It even quotes Caitlin Moran calling it a perfect hobby. Free, convenient.
Not fattening.
Exactly. Especially helpful, maybe, during those confusing teenage years.
Okay, so from pleasure, the source moves into desire, another complex one.
Definitely. The theology of desire is just wanting something inherently bad.
Or does it depend entirely on what we want?
That's the crux of it. The source explores this. It uses that example of a first kiss that doesn't live up to the hype.
Oh yeah, the anticlimax.
Right. It shows how much our expectations are shaped by movies, books, culture, not always reality.
Like those danger zone charts from health class.
Exactly. Those step-by-step guides, trying to manage behavior, often through fear.
So the source acknowledges those ascetic Christian traditions where any desire short of God is seen as problematic.
Yeah. Fasting, poverty, celibacy as the highest path.
But then it offers this other reading, right, from Genesis again.
Yeah, that desire isn't automatically selfish or sinful, but could be seen as love trying to happen.
That's a beautiful phrase. Love trying to happen.
It really shifts the perspective. Potential for connection, not just temptation. The source points to the Song of Songs here, too.
Right, which is pretty explicit about longing and desire.
Undeniably.
Yeah.
And it mentions that book, Eleanor and Park,
Oh, I love that book.
to show how intense that tension and desire can be, even without physical stuff happening. It's about that feeling of being truly seen.
That seeing and being seen. The source argues that's not just for marriage.
Exactly. That grace, that recognition can happen in many just loving interactions. But then it critiques how media often shows young women as sort of passive recipients of male desire.
Which isn't the reality for many women. The source mentions surveys showing lots of women's first sexual experiences weren't really driven by their own desire.
Right. Maybe wanting to feel loved or pressure or just going along with the partner. Societal scripts are powerful.
The author shares her own story, too, about choosing not to have sex in high school.
And the importance that it was her choice, not pressure either way.
But it also fairly represents the view that, hey, our bodies, our culture, they can mislead us, and some believe God's word is the clear guide here.
It holds that tension. And there's that anecdote about the summer fling,
Oh, yeah.
where after they slept together, the shallowness of the connection became super obvious. Sex didn't magically create depth.
So if pleasure is good, if desire isn't automatically bad, then the big question, what stops us, as the source puts it, from banging everyone? This brings us to ethics.
Exactly. Sexual ethics. The four suggests that maybe sexual sin isn't so much about which specific acts you do, but about how you treat your partner. Is there mutuality, reciprocity? Is there love?
It frames sexuality as something cherished, part of us, not shameful, and that love God, love your neighbor applies in the bedroom too.
Absolutely. But if traditional rules are shifting, we need to figure out what playing fair or just love actually looks like in practice.
And that means grappling with how we read the Bible, right? Not as a flat rule book.
Exactly. It's a record written by diverse humans over centuries in wildly different cultures. It needs careful interpretation, not just proof texting.
This is where Martin Buber comes in, isn't it? The I-thou idea.
Yes, relating to others and God, the eternal thou as whole, valued subjects, not objects to be used.
So applying that to sex, it's not about using someone for pleasure. It's about relating to them as a person.
It completely shifts the focus. It connects right back to Jesus' great commandment. Love God, love your neighbor. That's the ultimate ethical framework.
But there's a valid concern, isn't there? How do we avoid just slipping into an anything goes mentality?
Right. The source acknowledges that.
Yeah.
It's about finding an ethic that is still challenging, still calls us to be faithful disciples, not just comfortable.
It notes how often Christian discussions get stuck on lists of permitted acts for unmarried people.
Yeah, and it shares that question from a young lesbian woman wondering, okay, what are the boundaries for us if the conversation is always about heterosexual acts?
So it offers Lisa Soul Cahill's 4 ethical norms as a potentially more helpful framework.
Right. Do no harm, free consent, committed relationships, and respect for persons as sexual beings in society.
Those seem like solid principles, consent being absolutely key.
Absolutely non-negotiable. Affirmative consent. The source really emphasizes this, linking it to Christian calls to honor one another, to love like Christ. It pushes back hard against any idea that faith somehow makes consent less critical.
It counters that argument that consent alone is insufficient. Like, yes, it's the baseline, but...
But Christian ethics calls us higher, right?
Right.
Connor Friedersdorf's point. Just apply, be good to one another. It starts with consent, but goes deeper into care and respect.
And that personal story from the author, realizing that treating a friend badly in a non-reciprocal intimate situation felt worse, more demeaning than the physical act itself.
That really drives home the relational aspect, doesn't it? It's about the impact on the person.
Okay, this leads naturally into talking about singleness, a huge topic for many.
A really sensitive one, too. The source raises those big questions. Finding a soulmate, pressure to marry, celibacy or war. Could there be a righteous, maybe even sexually active, single life.
Jesus himself is presented as a model here, right? A single adult challenging norms.
Definitely. And it acknowledges the real-world factors, circumstance, bad luck, systemic issues like sexism or homophobia that affect singleness. It pushes back gently on the idea that God has some detailed romantic plan for everyone.
Suggesting God is more like the inspiration that moves us, rather than a puppet master pairing people up while allowing suffering.
Yeah, it can be a more freeing perspective for some. Less pressure to find the one on God's supposed schedule.
And it really calls for acknowledging the grief and shame that can surround singleness in our marriage-obsessed culture.
Giving space for that disappointment, that longing, and maybe imagining other ways to find fulfillment in community.
Recognizing that frustration when you feel like you're doing everything right and still end up alone.
But Christianity offers good news beyond just finding a spouse. It quotes Tanzila Ahmed. Maybe all the witness that I need in my life is simply my own. Powerful.
It also considers Jesus' humanity, him being a sexual creature, even if celibate.
Yeah, distinguishing celibacy, no sexual relationships, from chastity, which it argues is about moderation and healthy expression for everyone, single or married.
There's that anecdote about the author and her single friend comparing numbers.
And the point being, it's not for those coupled up to judge how singles navigate their sexuality.
Absolutely. And just acknowledging the sheer exhaustion of putting yourself out there, hoping for connection over and over.
Okay, chapter 5 uses nakedness as this potent metaphor for vulnerability.
Starting with that common nightmare, being naked in public.
Right. That taps into such a deep fear of exposure, of judgment. It connects it back to Genesis, naked and unashamed before, then making clothes after.
Raising the question, was the shame about the nakedness itself, or being creatures, or disobedience?
The source talks about different kinds of nakedness, glorious, mundane, dangerous, and how it forces us to confront our vulnerability.
But it's not just physical, is it? Emotional, spiritual, sexual vulnerability too.
Exactly. And it argues that appropriate vulnerability is necessary for just sex, which means we need to know ourselves. Where are we vulnerable? Where are we confident?
Because letting our guard down is key for intimacy, but we also need self-protection.
Yeah, and marriage doesn't automatically guarantee safety, unfortunately. Context matters hugely.
Some settings feel safe, affirming, others don't.
And the source suggests Jewish and Christian traditions offer ways to think about respecting vulnerability,
It brings in Carter Hayward's idea that eros, that desire, makes us vulnerable.
which opens us to joy, but also suffering. But Hayward sees that vulnerability as an antidote to trying to control or dominate another person.
Which is the opposite of what happens in assault or objectification.
Precisely, where mutuality is destroyed. The source shares that experience at the youth conference.
Right, where physical closeness felt okay because it grew out of community and relationship.
Context again. Then there's that poem, Man in Space, illustrating the vulnerabilities women might already carry into a relationship.
Contrasted with reading Victoria's Secret, which could be vulnerable, but maybe also empowering, owning one's sexuality.
Yeah, and that dating story. No physical lines crossed, but still feeling shame because of not being truly seen or valued.
Compared to the relationship with Josh, where physical intimacy felt like a natural outgrowth of trust and connection.
It ends with that Mary Oliver poem, highlighting the potential for real depth and intentionality in physical intimacy.
So moving beyond just the physical, Chapter 6 looks at intimacy more broadly.
Using that story of the summer friendship with the unspoken romantic tension.
That will they, won't they, feeling so many of us know.
And connecting it to that deeper fear. Being truly seen, flaws and all. We crave intimacy in friendships, family, spirituality, and with lovers.
The source defines intimacy not as like a mind meld, but as opening ourselves to be changed through relationship in holy, life-giving ways.
And it requires mutuality, vulnerability, disclosure, invitation, consent, and two distinct selves relating.
I liked Harriet Lerner's definition. Being who you are, letting the other person be who they are, and staying connected even with differences.
That's hard work. Accepting different filters, different worldviews. The author shares that light bulb moment arguing with her father-in-law.
Realizing they had totally different assumptions about family obligations.
Yeah, and the source critiques how rigid gender stereotypes in the church can actually block intimacy by limiting how we express love.
These scripts can feel oppressive. Intimacy is scary, but also exhilarating.
Which might explain why people sometimes avoid it through unhealthy coping mechanisms.
But it circles back to Grudorf's point. Intimacy with your own body is important too.
Especially for women, developing that self-knowledge crucial for partnered intimacy. It even mentions research linking adolescent masturbation to better partnered sex later.
Then it analyzes that scene from What Women Want.
Yeah, where the first sexual encounter lacked any real mutuality. No intimacy there.
And Friedis's findings on hookup culture, lots of ambivalence, unsatisfactory experiences.
Because that connection is missing. The source also pushes back against that idea that sex creates an unbreakable bond, the Horcrux defense.
Right.
True intimacy needs honesty, talking about feelings, hopes, fears, transcending assumptions.
And it ties the idea of limiting partners back to avoiding heartbreak, avoiding claiming someone who might belong to another, which sets up the next chapter on exes. Ah, yes, chapter 7. The theology of exes and dealing with our past.
All of it, the stuff we hate, the hurts done to us, the good things that are gone. It's messy.
The author uses her feelings about that song, Blurred Lines, to show how complicated memory is.
And shares that really painful memory from age 13, that unwanted encounter, the disgust, the violation. It shows how deep these things go.
So the chapter looks at how time, memory, forgiveness, hope all weave together with our histories.
Drawing on the Christian idea of time structured around before and after Christ, moments of change.
And that psalm, remember me according to your love, not my past sins. That hope for grace.
It acknowledges the real lasting impact of things like sexual assault or hookup culture, but still holds out hope for healing and resilience. It's not a simple fix.
Especially noting the unique damage when abuse happens in church settings, or the impact of coercion in early relationships.
It raises questions too. Has assault on campus actually increased, or are we just talking about it more?
Semantics matter, right? Defining consent clearly, even when it feels ambiguous. It critiques approaches that might silence survivors to keep the peace.
It uses those Greek words for time. Chronos, everyday time, and kairos, God's breakthrough moments. Jesus' life, death, resurrection is the ultimate kairos.
And Wesley's idea of grace working in us early on, that natural conscience telling us when something's wrong.
Illustrated by that story of Sarah's unwanted encounter, her shame, contrasted with the idea of salvation as a present reality, kairos interrupting chronos, offering healing now.
The author reflects on writing wedding vows, the pastor advising focus on grace for all things, good and bad.
It takes courage to look clearly at the past, especially for survivors. But the hope is that with grace, reflection, healing, the past loses its grip. We can be more present.
Okay, chapter 8, fidelity. This is a big one.
And the author admits her own past confusion, thinking if it wasn't physical, it wasn't infidelity, even with deep emotional connections elsewhere.
That's a common trap, maybe, focusing only on the physical act.
I think so. The source brings in Jesus saying, lustful looking is adultery of the heart. Our thoughts or desires matter.
But it distinguishes between like a fleeting desire and persistent lust.
Yeah, a flicker of attraction versus intentionally dwelling on it. It acknowledges chemistry is real, physical. It even uses dancing as an example.
And that funny Nerf football anecdote within marriage.
Shows that attraction can spark anywhere. But the point is, while chemistry matters in marriage, we still connect with others. Our spouse isn't our entire social and emotional world.
Enter Esther Perel, that tension between security and adventure.
And how we often expect one person to meet both needs, which is a huge ask.
The source argues fidelity and trust are foundational for an abundant life.
And clarifies that attraction tells us about ourselves. What gets us hot and bothered isn't always about another person.
Perel's idea. Intimacy is shared space. The erotic needs some mystery.
Challenging the idea that intimacy kills eroticism. No, nurture both.
It links back to Jesus wanting us to live fully, notice beauty, but also his warning about lust thoughts can harm.
O'Brien's experience of his body feeling like a betrayer, highlighting the need for emotional work before pursuing love, and that focusing on needs isn't inherently sinful. Compassion matters.
The author owns up to her past emotional infidelity.
The chapter concludes that we're called to love many people. Attraction is complex, but deep love requires commitment. Perel says commitment should expand the erotic imagination. Infidelity is often a failure to attend to the primary relationship.
Which leads perfectly into the final chapter, leaving and staying, knowing when a relationship should end.
That metaphor is great. The slow, flickering fluorescent bulb versus the sudden incandescent breakup.
Highlighting how hard it is to know. Do I love them? Yes. Can we build a life together? Maybe not.
And appreciating the grace of having a teammate who loves you, warts and all.
But acknowledging deal breakers, addiction, cruelty, racism, lack of humor, they vary, but they're real.
John Gottman's research comes in here. Masters versus disasters.
Those physiological differences, fight or flight in struggling couples, and bids for connection.
How crucial it is to turn toward those bids. Happy couples do it more, respond better, are kinder, avoid contempt.
The author sees gospel values in her non-Christian husband's kindness.
And that story of feeding the 5,000 trust leading to abundance. Masters of love? No, love isn't scarce. Kindness breeds kindness.
Her reason for wanting Josh? They were a team, contrasted with examples of couples clearly not making it.
But also acknowledging couples can learn to bridge differences. It takes work.
She shares stories of past breakups, alarming anger, or just realizing she wasn't all in.
It touches on the Disneyfication of love, but also the Christian root of perfect love casts out fear. But love isn't enough. You need the skills, the practices, and Paget's experience. That friend's advice. Do you make each other better?
It acknowledges people stay in bad situations, God wants healing, but sometimes it's not possible in that relationship.
And it critiques that settling advice for marry him, arguing true commitment is active work, not just accepting lice.
Wow. Okay, so that brings us pretty much to the end of this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground on Christian views on sex, love, relationships.
We really have, moving way beyond just that starting point of chastity.
Yeah, we talked about pleasure, desire, ethics, singleness, intimacy, dealing with the past, fidelity, and those tough calls about staying or leaving.
All trying to see it through a Christian lens that allows for more complexity, more nuance than just a list of rules.
So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to take away. What are your own assumptions about sex and faith? Has anything we discussed today maybe sparked a new way of thinking?
Perhaps opened up new avenues for understanding God, yourself, or others. It might be worth exploring the source more or digging into some of these theological ideas further.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.